Now that we understand the circumstances that can lead to reassessments of the lease term or the purchase of the underlying asset, let's look at what we do after making a reassessment. Under ASC 842, a reassessment of the lease term or an option to purchase the underlying asset will require us to remeasure the lease as of the date of the reassessment. But that's not the only circumstance in which we might remeasure a lease. So in this episode, we'll look closely at lease remeasurements under ASC 842. To begin, ASC 842 1035-4 states that a lessee shall remeasure the lease payments if any of the following occur. And let's try to break these down in plain English. First, if the lease is modified and the modification is not accounted for as a separate contract, we treat it similar to a remeasurement. Think of modifications as their own topic that we'll review in more detail later. But in certain circumstances, a lease modification will require us to remeasure the lease. Second, if the contract includes variable lease payments that depend on a contingent event, and that event is resolved so we can determine the amount and timing of the payments, we remeasure the lease to include them. This is different from the guidance we discussed earlier for usage or performance-based variable payments that are considered probable but have not yet been resolved. Those amounts are accrued as variable lease cost, but still do not affect the lease liability. But once the contingency is actually resolved and the payments become known fixed amounts, we consider them lease payments and must remeasure the lease liability to include them. But note that this guidance explicitly excludes changes based on a reference index or rate such as CPI. Then third, we remeasure the lease when there is a change to the lease term, or when we change our assessment of whether we are reasonably certain to exercise a purchase option for the underlying asset, which we just covered in the previous episode. And finally, when there is a change in the amounts probable to be owed under a residual value guarantee. Now, if you're following closely, you may notice something unusual. ASC 842 does not state that we remeasure a lease when a variable payment based on an index or rate is updated. As we've discussed, variable payments based on an index or rate are included in lease payments at their value on the commencement date. And under ASC 842, we do not remeasure a lease when those payments change during the lease term, unless we're already remeasuring for another reason. Paragraph 842 1035-5 states that when one or more of the events that require remeasurement occurs, variable lease payments that depend on an index or rate shall be remeasured using the index or rate as of the remeasurement date. But a change in the index or rate alone does not trigger a remeasurement. Instead, we treat the difference from the original amount used in the initial measurement of the lease liability as a variable lease cost on the P&L in the period incurred. And we've looked at how to approach that in a prior episode. So to put things simply, think of a lease remeasurement as being triggered by changes to our assumptions about the existing contract, rather than changes to the contract itself. A change in the lease term because the lessee reassesses whether it is reasonably certain to exercise a renewal option is a good example. That requires no change to the contract, only a change in our assessment of the current contract. Now, when a remeasurement is required based on the events we just covered, the accounting is relatively straightforward. ASC 842 2035-4 states that after the commencement date, a lessee shall remeasure the lease liability to reflect changes to the lease payments. The lessee must recognize the remeasurement as an adjustment to the right-of-use asset. If the carrying amount of the right-of-use asset is reduced to zero, Any remaining amount of the remeasurement is recognized in profit or loss. So in other words, once a remeasurement is triggered, we remeasure the liability, record the necessary adjustment, and the offset to that is the right-of-use asset or the income statement if the asset is fully written down. Unfortunately, two factors complicate the accounting. These are the discount rate used in the present value calculations and the lease classification. Anytime we remeasure a lease, we will reassess the lease payments, the allocation of consideration in the contract, the lease term, and the variable payments based on an index or rate. But what about the discount rate and classification? It's possible that a change in payments or a change in the discount rate could change the lease classification from operating to finance or vice versa. ASC 842 addresses this in paragraph 842.20.35.5. It states that when we remeasure a lease, the lessee shall update the discount rate at the remeasurement date based on the remaining lease term and remaining lease payments, unless the remeasurement is due to one of the following: a change in the lease term or the assessment of whether the lessee will exercise an option to purchase the underlying asset when the discount rate already reflected that option, a change in the amounts probable of being owed under a residual value guarantee, or a change in lease payments resulting from the resolution of a contingency upon which variable lease payments are based. For classification, ASC 842.10.25.1 states that an entity shall not reassess the lease classification after the commencement date unless the contract is modified and the modification is not accounted for as a separate contract, or if there is a change in the lease term or a change in the assessment of whether the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise a purchase option. So if we look back at paragraph 842.10.35.4, which lists the events that cause a remeasurement, the only event that will always require an updated discount rate is a modification that is not accounted for as a separate contract. We might update the discount rate if the remeasurement is due to a change in the lease term or a purchase option assessment, but only if the discount rate did not previously reflect that we had the option to extend, terminate, or purchase the underlying asset. For classification, if we remeasure due to a modification, a change in the lease term, or a change in the assessment of whether we are reasonably certain to exercise a purchase option, we must reevaluate lease classification as of the remeasurement date. But if our remeasurement is due to a change in our assessment of the amount probable of being owed under a residual value guarantee, or variable lease payments become lease payments, we do not have to reassess either the discount rate or lease classification, regardless of the effect of the remeasurement. And with that, we've covered the concepts behind lease remeasurements under ASC 842. In the next episode, we'll look at how to apply this in practice by remeasuring one of our current leases at Precision Industrial.